Hey everyone, Wayne Fox back with a video today about something that I've been playing with a little more lately, and that's how to get that silky water look if I don't have my tripod or if I don't have any neutral density filters. Using a slow shutter speed is a trick that landscape photographers have been using since, I don't know, probably since the beginning. I've never really researched it. And there is some debate as whether it's something you should do or not. The one thing I will say is that our eyes can only see at a certain speed. We don't actually see in still images because we're constantly exploring. And I know that if I look at moving water, I don't see frozen water. It's blurred together. And how fast it's moving depends on how much it's blurred. And so taking a 1/500th of a second shot of a waterfall or a wave isn't something our eyes are able to see. But artistic license means that we might exaggerate that look to get something that's a little more interesting. I remember the first time I ever used this technique. It's quite memorable for me. I was actually on my honeymoon, and I was up Big Cottonwood Canyon near Salt Lake City on a picnic with my new wife. And I had my camera with me, and I've heard of this before. I'd only been I'd been a kind of a hobbyist photographer for a while. And so I tried it, and the results aren't really spectacular. But I thought they were pretty cool at the time. Now this is a over 40-year-old slide you're looking at, so the colors are pretty whacked out. Whether we're trying to capture the feeling we get when we stand by the ocean, or we're trying to get that kind of really silky smooth look of water going over a cliff or up a slot canyon, it's all a technique that, I think adds some interest. And if you're sitting there without a tripod or you don't have some neutral density filters, there are things you can do to still get the photographs. Recently, I was in Hawaii and I started playing with this. This is a nice shot. This is handheld. And it's a decent shot. This is another one that was handheld, and this one's actually on a moving boat. And when we get to this, and I'll show you, this thing is rocking pretty violently. And then I was just out playing golf one day and I took a shot and I realized that I needed this shot to look a little more interesting. Now, before we get into the actual technique, let's talk about what we need to do when we capture the image. When we're doing photographs that involve silky water, there's a lot of decisions that we have to make. The main one is how long we're going to have the shutter open, whether it needs to be open for a long time because it's a 300-foot waterfall and we really need the water to blend together, or whether it's a relatively short time because it's just a little piece of a waterfall. Maybe we're sitting at the ocean and we're trying to capture a little bit of wave action, but we want it to smooth out a little bit. Or maybe we're sitting at a lake and we want that kind of glassy look without really any motion or ripples in it. It all is going to vary. Shooting at the ocean is probably the one that varies the most. A lot of times we're using a relatively short shutter speed. Sometimes we want a long shutter speed to really smooth the water out. And, it gives a really cool effect. Depends on the wave action and, what's going on as far as the water going over the edge. This is probably a little bit longer of a shutter speed. Here, this is a great big old wave, and I want to capture some of its size and power, and yet I want it to look a little bit more interesting. And, of course, maybe we're doing just little pieces of a wave, and there's a lot of different times that we could use to get different effects there as well. Waterfalls, on the other hand, vary in time as well. It depends on if it's a little piece. This is just the small bottom of a 300-foot tall waterfall. This waterfall is only about 4 feet tall, but I intentionally used an extra long exposure to get it really silky. And sometimes there's just so much water flowing and so much power that it doesn't take a very long exposure time to really exaggerate this effect. Now, if we're going to try to do this without a tripod or without neutral density filters, depending on the situation, basically that means that we can't get a long enough exposure time to get the effect that we're after. And so what we have to do is take multiple exposures and then blend them together in post-processing. Now, obviously, if you're trying to do a 1-second exposure and your shortest shutter speed you can actually get away with is a 60th because it's broad daylight, then that means you're going to need to take probably 60 frames to get the equivalent look. Now, a lot of times you can get away with a little bit less than that. It depends on if there are pieces of the water that can show little lines, but they don't blend together. But as you decide how many exposures you think it might take, you need to keep all these factors in mind. The one rule I always use is use the slowest shutter speed you can get away with. And sometimes you can use a tripod, but you don't have neutral density filters. And that means you can still get away with a 15th of a second or an 1/8 of a second, but you still might need to take 8 or 10 shots to give you that 1-second look. Or you might need to take 50 shots to give you a 6 or 8 or 10-second look. Obviously, it's a little difficult to shoot 400 shots because you want that silky water in the middle of the day at an ocean side or more. And there are things coming in technology. I have a camera which I can actually do that, and I'll talk about that at the very end. But what you need to really decide is how many shots do I need, and what can I do? And if you're hand holding, obviously what's the slowest you can get away with and not without getting them blurred. Now, the one thing I will mention is you're going to put your camera in continuous mode, and some cameras take a lot of frames a second, and you might find that even at a 20th of a second or a 15th of a second, if you're going to fire off a 40 or 50 shot burst, all you really need are one of those images to be sharp everywhere but the water. And there's a pretty good chance in 30 or 40 shots, even at a slow shutter speed, you're going to get away with that. So let me just show you 3 examples that I did recently while I was on a trip to Hawaii, and how I put those together, and what you do in Lightroom to make it easier, and how you move those into Photoshop, and how you end up with a finished product. So I think this one will be the best one to maybe demonstrate the overall technique on. One thing to keep in mind is this will not work in every situation. You can't really simulate a 1/15th of a second exposure time of rapidly changing water, such as a wave. Really, it works best when you've got a flow of water that's kind of repeating itself, such as a river or a waterfall, or you're trying to do a really long exposure, like simulating a 30-second exposure at the ocean. This is at my local golf course. If you look at the water on this one, you'll see that the little lines, each of those is a little streak of water. And when I'm there in person, it doesn't look at all like this. These little fountains they put on the golf courses to keep the water surface moving, they have a lot of softness to them. It's really a smooth flow. And so I needed to, after I took the shot of that, I need to somehow get a 1-second exposure so out of this. I was shooting with the RX107, and it's capable of shooting around 20 frames a second. So I decided I would go to the maximum high-speed continuous mode, and I would fire off about a 1-second burst. And the result, of course, is I end up with about 80-some photographs. It says 92. That means I actually fired 91, because this is my end result. This is what I ended up with. So I go from, this not very smooth water to this kind of smooth, nice look. Now, the one challenge you have is you got to figure out which stack or which image goes to which burst. So one thing I'm going to recommend when you're shooting these, make sure you take a 2 or 3 second pause between every burst. I'm assuming you're going to be in continuous mode, and even with a high-res camera, you're going to be able to get 3, 4, 5, 6 frames a second. And the reason you do that is because then it's pretty easy to get these in sorted. If I just click on all of these, and I right-click and I go to stacking, and I use this auto stack by capture time. This dialog lets me set the amount of space that Lightroom will use to determine what goes in what stack. Now, as long as you went 3 or 4 seconds, then you can just use this at 2 and you're in good shape. In my case, one of the 2 I shot too quick, and I end up with 2 of the stacks pushed together. So I had to go 1 second. It still worked. I know I took 4 different sequences, and we just say stack. And what we end up with are now these 4 different stacks or 4 bursts. I'm going to look at each one. I'm going to decide which one I like the best. Now, this one here I've done some adjustment on. So this is the one I'm going to use. And if we open that one up and go to grid mode, these are all the shots that we're going to use here. Now, you can do some processing. I would caution you on using things like adjustment brushes unless they're very, very subtle edges, depending on how much you moved around. But in this case, I did do some processing first. This is the before. Let's just show the before and after. So this was the before and this is the after. So you can see what I did is I just basically used my HSL sliders, and I probably used the targeted adjustment tool to pull in some of that sky and to make the colors a little bit better. And then I just synchronize those across all the other images in the stack. So once we've done that, we're going to select all of those images, and we're going to edit in Photoshop, and we're going to ask it to open as layers in Photoshop. And if I go over to Photoshop, you'll see that it's in the process of doing it. And now this will take a few minutes. There's a lot of stacks. And of course, if you shoot a higher res camera than the 20 megapixel RX100, it'll take even longer. But, go grab a drink or, go visit with the kids or something while it's doing it. Not too bad. That only took about 45 seconds. Now, the next thing we need to do is align all of these images. And to do that, we just click the top one, shift click on the bottom one. Under Edit, we go to Auto Align Layers. And usually you can just leave the auto on. I have had a few times where it was kind of weird and I'd use reposition, because really all that Lightroom should be doing is slightly moving them. It shouldn't be trying to stretch and manipulate pixels. Hit OK. And again, another couple of minutes while this lines these all up. So not too bad. So now if I turn the eyeballs off, each one at a time, you'll see the only thing that really should be changing is the water itself. Now, because it's a little windy out there, the leaves in the trees are moving around. And what we want to do now is find what we feel is the sharpest image. Now, you can do this over in Lightroom. It's actually maybe a little easier. And once you figure out which one it is, this case, I thought this one here was maybe the sharpest. And whether it is or not, I didn't take a lot of time. But what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate that one. And we're going to drag it to the top. All right, and we're going to turn all the others back on. We're going to select everything except that top layer now. I'm going to right click. I'm going to go Convert to Smart Object. And this will take 2 or 3 minutes depending on the size of the files and how many there are. One thing to notice, it doesn't actually give you a dialog box. It just gives you that little spinning weird cursor, so you really don't know how close it's going to be. But anyway, now that it's done, we have all 20 layers into this one smart object. Go up under Layer, Smart Objects, and down here there's one called Stack Mode, and we're going to go to Median. So it's going to average all of those pictures together. And when we're done, if we turn off this top layer, we'll see that our water is now silky smooth. Now, because it was blending all of the movement in the trees, they're going to look really bad, but that's what we've done. That's why we've used this other layer. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put a mask on this top layer. We're going to grab our brush, and we're going to just basically paint in wherever there's water. I'm not going to be very careful. You might need to be a little more careful. But it's pretty straightforward. But at that point, now we've got this nice silky water. And I can just turn the mask off and on. You can see the results. So now the lake is more interesting, and the water's smooth, and it really is a pretty easy technique. So the last thing I typically do is I don't need this to open this smart object to get to any of those individual shots anymore. And so to make this file smaller, I'm just going to go ahead and rasterize that layer. So it's now a simple single layer. And now it's a much smaller file when I save it. So here's another example, and this lets me show a couple of things. If we look at this image here, and let's go to grid mode, you can see that I took a lot. This was with my RX100, which is capturing 20 frames a second. I've already gone and stacked these, so I did 34 on the first capture group, I did 31 on the second burst, and this last one I did 54 shots. Now, one thing that's interesting to do here is if I go to this stack and I go to the last image, so I've highlighted all those, and then I bring the first one into 100%. If I hold the arrow key now, it's just going to continue to cycle through those ones that I've selected. And if you've set up your stacks correctly, what you should see is a little bit of a video. And of course, how close it gets to a real video depends on how many frames a second your camera's been capturing. If anything makes a weird jump in the middle of these, then it means that you probably took another composition. I'll actually show that here in a second with another one I've got. So anyway, we're going to do the same thing. First of all, we're going to go to grid mode, and I'm going to just right click on these, and I'm going to say edit all these as layers in Photoshop. So here we have it in Photoshop. First thing we're going to do is align the layers. Click on the bottom one, go to Edit, Auto Align Layers, and hit OK. Now that they're aligned, let's pick our sharpest file. I think that this one here was the sharpest. So I'm going to hit Command or Control J to duplicate that layer and drag it to the top. I'm going to select all of the other layers now. And we're going to right click and convert those to a smart object. Once I've got them as a smart object, I go to Smart Objects, Stack Mode, and average those by selecting Median. Now I add my mask to my sharp layer at the top, and I paint out the water. Now, one thing to note is for most of the image, you don't need to be very careful because nothing else is moving. And even if I zoom in, let's zoom in here, and you can see that even if I paint clear over here way outside, it doesn't hurt anything because those averaged as sharp as the original image. So all I have to watch out for are things that are moving in shots, such as the grass in the foreground. Now this is a good example to show what happens if you don't shoot enough files. Because I shot 54 of this one, I've already done a set of these which show the difference between using 10, 20, 30, 40, and 54 layers. So here's my group. You can see each layer combines a different amount of the original layers. So let's just start looking at these. This is the area that's painted out. And if I turn on the 10 layers, and let's zoom in. Now you can kind of see this repeating pattern that I'm getting. And I don't know why it kind of repeats like this, but this is pretty typical if you don't have enough exposures and you can't blend it smooth. So let's go ahead and show the difference. And as we add more files to the shot, and this is really fast moving water, obviously. So now this is with 20, and this is with 30. Now we have 40. And now we have all 54. And you can see it, even at all 54, there's a little bit of pattern to it, but the difference between 10 and 54 is pretty dramatic. Probably 30 would have worked okay and it would have looked fine, but that just shows you that sometimes you need to take a few more shots than you might think if your shutter speed's pretty short. In this particular case, I'm only at 1/60th of a second. And so because I'm getting 20 frames a second, now imagine if I was only getting 4 frames a second, I would probably still need to shoot 50 frames, but it would take a 10 or 11 second burst instead of a 3-second burst. And let me just show you one more example. This one isn't really that great of a shot, but it's more of an example to show how extreme this is. If I take a look at these images, let me go to the first one. One thing that I mentioned before, if I hold the key down, you'll see that this is playing kind of a video, right? And this time I'm just going to cycle through it. Now you'll notice that I get right here and there's a sudden jump. So that means up to there, that's one composition. Then I took it and there's another composition. Sometimes if the stacking mode doesn't work good, you can find where you change it just by looking where it jumps. So from there to the beginning is one stack. And we can just tell them to stack. And then from this one to the end is one stack. Now these are taken with my A6500, so I think I'm only getting about 9 frames a second, something like that. So, and you can see that my shutter speed on these is 1/60th of a second. And this just goes to show you that you can get away with this technique sometimes without even taking near as many shots as you think you need to. So the reason I think I can get away with fewer images here is because the water in this case is not moving nearly as fast or as far. So the water doesn't travel as far between each exposure as it did in the big waterfall because it's trickling down this rock face. Whereas in the big waterfall, the water's in a full free fall at that point. Now, one of the challenges I have on this, you'll notice how I was jumping around. I'm actually standing in a boat and I'm moving all over the place. So we're going to go ahead and grab these 11 and we're going to open them as layers in Photoshop. One thing I'll mention, it's far better to crop this after you do the merging rather than crop them in your raw files, because that way you can make sure that you get as much capture as you can. And you'll see that in just a second how far these are lined up. There we go. And I don't know which one of these is the sharpest. I don't think I really got a sharp one in any of these. So we're just going to assume this top one is. Well, let's align them first real quick. We'll align them. And you'll notice how much movement there is. But notice, now that they're aligned, despite how much they jumped around, the only thing really moving is the water. There's a little bit of weirdness going on. But remember, this top one is going to be our main one. So next thing we need to do is, of course, take all of these, convert them to a smart object. And now we're going to average those. So layer, smart objects, stack mode, median. And now our water is soft. And of course we turn this on. Okay, add our mask. Grab our brush. And just begin painting these in. This one's a little more tedious because we have all these little rivulets. So you don't have to be real careful because the areas outside are rock, so they should have averaged together pretty consistently. One of the challenges I've got is I really didn't get a sharp image on this despite the shutter speed, so I'm not sure why. So this is probably not an image I would ever be able to do much with. I mainly took it for practice. And one thing I'll mention while I'm doing this, if you are in a situation where you don't have ND filters, and more especially if you don't have split ND filters, the other thing that this technique does is pretty dramatic at reducing noise in the shadows. So if you take an image and you pull your shadows up, so let's say that it's you've got kind of a sunset, and you expose, and then a single shot, and you pull your shadows up. As long as you've got quite a few images, that noise will average out. And so you can get pretty extreme in your adjustment from highlight to shadows if you're going to average several shots together. And that's actually what my new digital back does. My digital back, the new Phase 1 back, can actually average this on the fly in the camera itself at the sensor level. And it's a technology, I don't think it's in a lot of the sensors that Sony makes. I've researched it a lot, and it's a little tricky to use. But the cool part is that I can average 50 or 80 or 100 shots at whatever shutter speed I want, and I end up with only one raw file. It's pretty cool. As long as my exposure time is longer than my scan time, which is on a large digital back like that, I think is around a half a second. Basically, this is like having the shutter open for the entire time. It's all pretty much the same as an actual 28-second exposure. It's really cool, and I think it's a technology that it's going to migrate to smaller cameras. I think that eventually most cameras will probably have this because it's something that's really useful, and I think photographers would like it. Well, hopefully I answered your questions on that. It's something you might try. If you have anything that puzzles you or any questions about it, just drop a comment down below. Appreciate those that watch my videos. They're fun to make. This one's really been kind of fun to make because it's something I've been doing a little bit more. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button down there. And if you like the video, please hit that like thing so that YouTube will give me a little bit better rating on my videos. And until next time, hey, see ya.